we look at volunteering, as I've already mentioned, that hasn't changed. It's stable, as is the average hours volunteering, as is the total hours. So the rate of the total picture on volunteering here at the aggregate level is stability. I don't want people to think that that means all is well in terms of volunteering in Canada. These numbers haven't changed since 2004. We did a study in 2003 and asked charities and nonprofits what were the biggest challenges they faced in terms of their capacity to fulfill their mission. And of the top 6 items, 3 of them related to volunteering. We don't have any evidence to suggest that's changed. So although the picture here is stable, I don't want you to believe or to come away with the impression that means the situation is terrific from the perspective of the organizations that depend on volunteers. We've already talked about how thin the base of support is for giving. You'll see a similar picture when we look at volunteering. And if you pay attention to the red base of this pyramid, 5% of the population provide 421 hours or more in terms of their giving. That makes that 5% who are giving 421 hours are 10% of all volunteers, and they account for 54% of total volunteer hours. So 1 in 10 Canadians are providing half of all the volunteer hours in the country. Again, a very thin base of support if we want to sustain and hopefully grow this activity in the future. And who are they? Actually, we see much of the same relationships as we did with giving, age, education, income, religious activity. A slight difference is we see a pop here, and I'll show you a slide, higher levels of volunteering among young Canadians than in the rest of the population. We also see the role of school-aged children, which are present in the household. And essentially what we see is those who have school-aged children tend to volunteer more than those who have children in the home in particular. There's two things happening with the presence of children in the home. When you have preschool-aged children in the home, the volunteer rate and hours declines because it's harder, obviously, to be able to go out of the household and do volunteering. And then as children get into school age, you start to see the volunteer rate increase and the hours increase as children start to introduce new opportunities for parents to volunteer in their community. Here's the age breakdown. The highest percentage volunteer rate is among youth 15 to 19, 65%. Then drops, comes up a little bit among the 35 to 44-year-olds, and then steadily declines to 36% for seniors 65 and older. Now the hours give us a very different picture. The youth who are 15 to 19, although they volunteer the most, they volunteer the smallest number of hours. In contrast, senior citizens 65 and older, who have the lowest volunteer rate, volunteer the most hours on average. If you were looking at your volunteer profiles of your volunteer organizations, the demographic of your volunteer pool, you can already see here is a suggestion of the kinds of hours you can expect to get from the various age segments in your pool. The income breakdown, which will look a lot like the education breakdown, is similar to what we saw with charitable giving. The lowest level of volunteering among those who have household incomes on the small end, less than 20,000 household income, the lowest volunteer rate, increasing to 60% for those who have household incomes of 100,000 or more. But the hours move in the other direction. Now, just to bear in mind, there are relationships between all of these variables, age, education, and income, and so some of the older Canadians may have lower incomes, so we may be seeing part of that as an age factor. But nevertheless, there are substantial differences in terms of both propensity to volunteer and the hours that are donated that relate to income. We've seen age as well as education. We talked about early life experiences. How does that play out on the volunteering side? We see the same kind of dramatic effect. The bar that's on that green, the yellow bar, is the national volunteer rate at 46%. The red bars are what the volunteer rate is among those who've engaged in the various activities that are laid out before you when they were young. So those who are active in student government as adults are volunteering at a rate of 61% compared to the national rate of 46%. If your parents did volunteer work, the volunteer rate is 58% as opposed to 46%, and so on. So again, evidence that getting these behaviors established among young Canadians is the answer, or one of our answers, to trying to have a sustainable presence in charitable giving and volunteering in the country. One of the things that's interesting to us is when we looked at barriers, and there are barriers in the reports, more information in these reports. By the way, you'll be getting copies of these reports. Do you have them yet, or at the end?
At the end.
At the end. You'll be getting copies of the reports at the end. One of the interesting things for us is that we do have the highest volunteer rate among 15 to 19-year-olds and a fairly high rate among 20 to 24-year-olds, but still significant numbers of them said that they didn't volunteer more because they weren't asked or because they didn't know how to become involved, much higher than the rest of the population. So there is still opportunity to, it seems to us, to grow volunteering within that age segment. Where do the volunteers volunteer? The volunteer rate is highest among four, and we'll see the hours are similar: sports and recreation, social services, education and research, religious. That's a slightly different profile than we saw with charitable giving. Remember, health was at the top for that. The hours, religious again, 18% of all volunteer hours go to religious organizations. But then sports and recreation and social services are the next two, followed by education and research. 52% of all charities and nonprofit organizations rely on volunteers, and when you look at this profile, you're starting to see those types of organizations that are really for which volunteering is important, particularly sports and recreation. What are volunteers doing? Well, the top two are organizing or supervising events, followed by teaching or mentoring. Then we have office work, fundraising, serving on a committee or board, counseling or providing advice, providing health care or support, coaching, and then the rest are 5% or less, with the exception of our catch-all other category. The provincial rates: Saskatchewan leading the way, followed by the Yukon. Quebec, Ontario, BC, Newfoundland, and Labrador with rates that are more closely to the national average. In terms of hours, we see a very different profile. Now Nunavut leads the way in terms of hours, Nova Scotia as well. Quebec, in terms of average hours, those that do volunteer hours that are very close to what's happening in Ontario or Manitoba, and then Alberta and BC also very close behind.